Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Let's get started with our webinar, Connectivity Conversations number 3, Infrastructure in High-Risk Environments, the case of the BRI. This is the third installment of a series of webinars dealing with multiple dimensions of connectivity, and it's running in the context of a project, a 2-year project ongoing here at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. My name is Bart Gans, and I'm a leading researcher here at FIA. Now, the first 2 installments of these webinar series dealt with digital connectivity. But today, however, we will be looking at what maybe most of us would associate with connectivity, and that is infrastructure connectivity. We'll be focusing on the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is, a very often discussed and also often criticized topic, especially in the context of the impact of the BRI on trade flows, on the role of the BRI in China's soft power or China's agency in global governance, or on its role in geopolitics, basically, in the ongoing great power competition. It's also very often discussed in the context of geoeconomics, in the sense that rather than using infrastructure and connectivity as a way to maximize profits, let's say, China and probably also other countries are using connectivity as a tool for power projection. However, one topic that is rather under-researched, let's say, is the link of connectivity with conflict risk in fragile states. And of course, the case of the BRI is highly salient in that respect. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce today's main speaker, and that is Pascal App. Welcome, Pascal. Pascal is a senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute Frankfurt, PRIF, and his research focuses on how a rising China is interacting with global conflict environments. At the moment, he is conducting a research project on the impact of the Belt and Road Initiative, especially, I believe, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, on conflict states. So I would like to now yield the floor to Pascal. I would still like to add for the audience that you don't have to wait until the end or until when I open the floor for questions. You can already start typing your questions in the chat box during the presentations as well as during the ensuing comments by our discussants. So Pascal, I will now give the floor to you, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bart, for the invitation, and thank you very much also to the audience for tuning in so numerously from Helsinki or wherever else you may be in the world. As Bart mentioned, I'm going to be focusing on an aspect of the BRI that's often a bit overlooked when we focus on it as a tool of Chinese global agency. And that is basically the challenges it is facing on the ground in the countries where it is being constructed and where conflict risks are actually a very, very major challenge. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I hope you can all see the presentation now. Yes, I'm seeing nodding, that's good. Okay, so I wanted to begin this talk by introducing a very basic pattern to you. And the graph which I'm showing basically has on one axis the amount of BRI investments in a country, and on the other an index of its state fragility, which is a very rough measure for how likely that state is to experience state failure or protracted interstate conflict. And as you can see from the distribution of the dots and the line that basically shows you the bivariate relationship between those 2 indicators, this is a positive relationship. So interestingly, the more fragile a state is, the more investments it attracts under the BRI. And as you can imagine, this is highly counterintuitive because from a risk management viewpoint, you would expect investments to cluster in the safest environments. If you put the most money in the most fragile states, then this is at least somewhat curious, and it's indicative that risk management, especially political risk management, is a bit of a problem here. And as you can see, a lot of that comes from the fact that some countries that are especially fragile, most notably Pakistan, the case all the way in the upper right corner here, which is also the one that I'm going to be talking about. A couple of explanations maybe out of the way why we are observing this pattern at all. So this is nothing that is specific to the BRI, but it basically follows the trajectory of Chinese overseas investments, especially in the resource sector, that we already saw under those earlier instances of China Inc. going out to the world. And the reason here is that China is an industrial latecomer. So when China began importing industrial resources on a large scale, it often had to obtain them in the few places where concessions could still be obtained, and they hadn't already been snapped up by the much earlier industrializing countries of Europe, North America, or Japan. And one of the reasons why those resources were still available is that those states are highly unstable. So that's one basic pattern that is reoccurring under the BRI, basically, which was also designed to fill a specific niche of unmet infrastructural needs, especially in the global south. And a second reason for this is that risk management is not the only concern behind the BRI. So we've very often talked, of course, about the big geopolitical visions behind it. There's also some domestic political objectives, like bolstering the development of China's western regions, for example, which just so happen to link up to fragile states like, for example, Pakistan. So basically, because of this mixture of political and economic objectives that were especially pronounced in the early years of the BRI, that is the reason why political risks were not given the sort of attention that they maybe should have deserved, and where China is now again playing catch up, basically that a lot of investments and commitments were already made, and now, only now, can you start figuring out on how to deal actually with the conflict risks that they are facing. And I'm going to be turning now to a case study which we conducted last year on the case of Pakistan, which to us was really most interesting because you had this overlay of very high Chinese investments. So in terms of sums already paid, about $30 billion. In terms of sums committed, more than 60 billion. And these interestingly occurred in a state where the Chinese construction crews actually building all of these BRI projects had already faced a long history of attacks specifically directed against them. So this is not just a case of infrastructure being built in a challenging environment, but also one where the infrastructure has come under direct threat as a result. And what I'm going to be talking a bit about is the reasons for that. So why the BRI has faced such a backlash, especially in a country that is otherwise politically quite friendly with China. And also to give you guys a bit of a glimpse on what China is doing to ameliorate this situation. So this is something which I think I'm going to summarize very quickly in the interests of timekeeping. CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, is a relatively recent project. It was only launched in 2015, but it is probably the national level BRI implementation that is the most comprehensive in the entire world. So connectivity is a big part of it, the idea to build economic corridors across the whole of Pakistan. But it also has a second initial priority in energy generation, where Pakistan was facing a huge supply crisis. And subsequent phases of CPEC are also supposed to focus on, for example, industrial and agricultural development. So something that is really designed to lift living standards in Pakistan. So if that is supposed to do so much good for Pakistan, you may wonder, why has it faced such a backlash? And there we have to zoom in on the fact that infrastructure or developmental efforts in general tend to be politically highly controversial. And one of the biggest controversies, which I'm going to be mostly focusing on, is where projects were actually distributed in the country, because that's where connectivity was really important. And I'm going to be showing you a map that is maybe a little convoluted, but what we're seeing here is a map of Pakistan with a Human Development Index of its individual counties, colored in basically red if these are lesser developed areas, and green if they are more highly developed. And what you can see here is a very pronounced east-west split. So the east of Pakistan, that is the province of Punjab, is the most highly developed part of the country. And the western part is its much poorer, less developed, and also less infrastructurally accessible periphery. So when CPEC was first being discussed, and you had these plans about building a corridor across the whole of Pakistan that was supposed to link the area at the Chinese border, that is roughly up here, if you can see my mouse cursor, with a Chinese-built port in the city of Gwadar, which is here in the southwest. You can maybe see that the most direct route to take between those 2 points would have actually led through the lesser developed western periphery. So the red areas of the map, which is especially Balochistan down here. What you can, however, see in the yellow lines in the map is the roads that were then subsequently actually constructed under CPEC. And as you can see, those are predominantly located in the already highly developed eastern part of the country. And that was a massively controversial topic when those plans first emerged, because the provinces on the western periphery basically complained that they were being left out of this, that although they were the ones in most need of infrastructural development, they wouldn't be getting any of it. And that as a result, they would also be losing out on the supposedly follow-up plans to build industrial development. Because if you don't have connectivity access, then that is unlikely to materialize. Something else, maybe the blue triangles, which you see in this map, those are newly constructed power plants. And there you can also see that they're clustered in the east and clustered near major metropolitan centers in the east. So here the problem is that energy generated in those centers can often not be transported all the way across the country, and people in rural areas miss out on that. That was a huge issue when I was in Pakistan last year, because you had this heat wave rolling the country. And as a result, electricity had to be rationed. And it was especially rural areas that had to bear the brunt of this, where they often had to go without electricity for most of the day. And imagine what that means in 45-degree temperatures. It means that you have no air conditioning, and it means that you have no refrigeration. So that is actually an issue where a lack of electricity can become life-threatening. So this just for one of the very basic controversies and where the local backlash against CPEC, or at least the manifestation of CPEC that actually developed, then came from. What it has resulted in is, I would say, two different kinds of resistance against it. One is very, very visible, and that has resulted in the aforementioned direct attacks on Chinese construction crews. And the other one is more widespread, but a general political resistance. And I'm going to be talking about, in the final part of this presentation, how China dealt with those challenges and what it did as a result to make sure that its projects could still be safely constructed. And I think there, Pakistan is not just an interesting case study, but also probably indicative for the reality of the BRI in the future. So first of all, the security dimension. So this is very well covered because of a history of militant attacks against projects and against Chinese citizens in the country that have already claimed between 50 and 60 lives, most of whom, by the way, were still Pakistani, but also a couple Chinese citizens that were caught in those blasts. And as a result of that, CPEC could only proceed through a regime of very, very tight military security. So basically, Chinese engineers arriving in the country are immediately whisked away to their workplace, where they live in a highly secured compound, and they only move about by military escorts. And as you can imagine, this kind of security regime also has an impact on the lives of local people. So on the one hand, that it boosts the strength of the military in a country that has seen repeated military coups. So that is also a political power issue. And on the other hand, that the security measures which you have to undertake to, for example, build a project like Gwadar, this harbor on the Indian Ocean, results in a lot of checkpoints and security measures that are seen as harassing and sometimes even impact on the livelihoods of local people. So if you are a fisherman in Gwadar, you nowadays have problems actually accessing your fishing grounds because the Pakistani Coast Guard is constantly patrolling the coast. and is often excluding local fishermen from pursuing their work there. The other problem which these measures have had is that they are very often ineffective. So these are not new. They've already been in place for a long time, and they have not been able to completely stop the string of attacks against Chinese projects and citizens. In fact, they have expanded, and they now have also gone after targets where military protection is not even supplied because they are not part of CPEC. So, for example, last April, I believe, you had an attack against some Chinese teachers at the Confucius Institute in Karachi. And we have seen similar things happening even in very, very highly secured sites, like, for example, a dam construction project in 2021, where an insurgent group successfully bombed a convoy of Chinese engineers. And as you can imagine, this has led to diplomatic tensions with China at the international level, where basically there's increasing pressure from the Chinese side on the Pakistani military to make sure that its citizens abroad are being effectively protected, which, at least as of now, is not the case. Then talking a bit about the more widespread political resistance against CPEC. This is actually a case where originally it was seen as domestically a problem that the party that had originally negotiated the project with China was turned out of office in 2018, and the government that replaced it had previously been very, very critical of the project. They had pointed out problems like, again, its project distribution, as well as the lack of transparency over the kind of financial arrangements that were made to finance those projects. That, as you can have probably already heard, is a widespread problem with the BRI in general. And this led to a kind of a disruption in the progress of CPEC for a short time, at least. But what was really instructive subsequently is how China reacted to that and managed to get even skeptical political actors on board to establish a pretty broad, at least elite consensus about going ahead with CPEC. And what it did was to institute, for example, a so-called joint consultation mechanism, where the Chinese side sits together with representatives from the major national and some regional Pakistani parties, and basically tries to engage them in a political coalition in support of CPEC. So it's kind of a soft power exercise to make sure that, on the one hand, the interests of those parties are respected in the project, but on the other hand, that you have a kind of insurance against the government turnover, that a new government is not going to suddenly start tearing up contracts or such. It's also had a lot of components that are, to me at least, pretty reminiscent to the much, much broader societal relations, for example, that you see between the US and many of its allies. So very intense cooperation now in the think tank sector between Chinese and Pakistani institutes, where often the interest is also in building a politically supportive constituency inside Pakistani elites. So basically trying to get Pakistani think tanks to sing the praises of CPEC, and due to their status as opinion leaders, get the rest of the maybe skeptical public on board with that. It's also branched out into broader social programs, like, for example, at least before the pandemic, visiting programs to China. And one part that is really, really popular, making education opportunities within China accessible to Pakistani students. So there you have scholarship programs at the university level, for example, and also a lot of skills training programs inside these newly developing economic zones that are supposedly designed to equip locals with the skills to then pursue careers there. As well as, by the way, media cooperation. So ways to transmit Chinese media content and therefore also prefer Chinese narratives into Pakistan. And as you can imagine, many of these narratives tend to also revolve around CPEC and the benefits of political alignment between China and Pakistan. So what all of this has resulted in, and this is really interesting because it has been so successful at building a very, very broad and robust consensus at the elite level. So, for example, you had another government shift in 2022, just last year. The government of Imran Khan fell. He is now in all sorts of different trouble. But the interesting thing is that the coalition that replaced him actually went ahead with CPEC again and may have actually sped up the implementation of projects further. So this, at least from this perspective, it's been spectacularly successful in navigating those kinds of political problems. It's also been successful, I think, at projecting a positive image of China in Pakistan, and also crucially avoiding blame for the shortcomings of CPEC in general. So this is really another thing that stuck out to me, that every single, or let me put it the other way, no person that we talk to in Pakistan ever blamed China for the problems with CPEC. Basically, it was always due to, at least in their point of view, domestic governance failures, other issues like corruption, for example, or the involvement of military interests. But nobody ever blamed China for those kinds of fundamental problems and political strife that you have seen as a result. And then just briefly in closing, what all of this means and why we shouldn't care not just about Pakistan, but the BRI's presence in conflict-affected states in general. The way I'm always describing this is that the BRI is not just a tool through which Chinese influence is being projected abroad, but that China's presence in those countries also acts back on the country itself. So as a result of being enmeshed, especially in these conflict challenges overseas, China is now under pressure to change its own foreign and security policy. And there you have seen a long goodbye, I would say, from this previously very, very prominent principle of non-interference in the domestic affairs of other countries, where China is now simply being called upon to intervene more directly as a result of, for example, threats to its citizens and invested capital. And I think this is a major driver that you're also seeing in recent phenomena like this announcement of a Chinese global security initiative, which I think is not mirrored, not intended to mirror, for example, the kinds of security relationships with the US has with its allies, which are about deterring external threats and military cooperation, but much, much more about shoring up their domestic stability. And this is where China actually has a big, I would say, competitive advantage due to the amount of tools which it has for repression and stability building measures from its domestic politics. And finally, since the project which is being run at FIA is looking at the different aspects of connectivity as a locus of competition, conflict, or maybe also at times cooperation and complementarity, I think that also comes in here, actually. Because on the one hand, the BRI is maybe complementary to existing development efforts of Western actors because it is so willing to incur risks, and because it is willing to go into countries where Western capital does not dare to tread. But on the other hand, the fact that China is often lagging awareness of the kinds of political problems that exist in those areas, or that there is a widespread belief that you can just, provide development and then everybody can agree to that, and you're going to see peace as a result. That is perhaps something where China could learn from the experiences of Western actors, especially when it comes to managing conflicts related to infrastructure and developing a kind of sensitivity for those challenges internally, for example, on the parts of the implementing companies. Since I think I have used up my time, I'm just going to leave it there. I'm probably going to just post this presentation in the chat because it also points to a couple publications that you might be interested in reading. And otherwise, I'm looking forward to Tune's comments and, of course, the questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pascal, for this very clear presentation on an important and underexplored topic. And also thank you for making it quite concrete and empirical by having a look at the CPEC. I think there's lots of food for thought there. There's also much to unpack, so I'm sure there's quite a lot of questions that we can ask. I could maybe start with one, because a couple of days ago I was reading the latest OECD report. It's called States of Fragility 2022, basically saying that, well, a quarter of the world's population lives in so-called fragile contexts. And I think the report went to 60 case studies of fragile states. One of the conclusions was that fragility has increased globally, not least because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Another few interesting, at least so I thought, conclusions were that not all of those fragile states are low income. In fact, there were more middle income states than low income states that were fragile. They were not all part of sub-Saharan Africa. Actually, the largest increase was Afghanistan and Myanmar. And also 51 out of 60 of those states were not in a state of war. And well, the reason for that is that there are other drivers of fragility, economic, environmental, political, social, and many other drivers that relate to human development. But my question is as follows: that you seem to be focusing on conflict and conflict risk. And fragility certainly includes those. Fragility includes violence, conflict, but also things like inequality and food insecurity, poverty, forced displacement, and so on. But then in your graph, you seem to be applying the state fragility index. So basically, my question is, why do you use conflict and conflict risk as the basis for your research and not fragility or fragile contexts or fragile states?
Mm-hmm. This is mainly because we're interested in exploring the intersection of infrastructural development and conflict dynamics. So what we wanted to look at is the most controversial aspect of infrastructure, basically. In other areas, this is, of course, much less controversial because their infrastructure can make a positive contribution to the stability of a country by, for example, shoring up its resilience against extreme climate events. So that, by the way, is also an urgent concern, especially in Pakistan. But what we were most interested in was the political angle of this, where at least the assumption from the Chinese side has often been that infrastructure can have the kind of political effect that it has had in China itself, of boosting development and thereby also boosting the stability of the state and society, because people see that things and feel that things are moving forward, that they have a positive expectation of the future. And that this is, in the long run, also going to take away a major root cause of conflicts. So that's at least the Chinese side. When you look at Chinese concepts like the so-called developmental peace, where this has been extensively discussed. And what we wanted to show is how those ideas measure up if you're being exposed to a country where a political consensus basically does not exist, and where developmental efforts can also very soon become very controversial because they are almost always differential. So some areas benefit and some others do not. And this is a key point at which, even though something may be designed to help a country, if you look at it from a bird's eye perspective, like boosting its overall economic growth, for example, it maybe has adverse effects when it comes to internal stability and exacerbating existing conflict dynamics. And that's why the case studies which we conducted are focused on these most extreme cases of fragility, where a state has either completely broken down, as for example you have seen in Myanmar, or where you have a long history of insurgent movements that can still operate, at least in some parts of the country, like in Pakistan. Hope that answers the question.
Yes, very well. Thank you. Okay, then let's move on to our discussant for today. In the meantime, I would like to urge the audience to, by all means, type the questions in the chat box. Our discussant is FIA's very own Tune Karjalainen. She is researcher in the European Union Research Programme, and her research focuses on European Union foreign and security policy and differentiated integration in the EU. But her publications also cover peace building, crisis management, and peace mediation. She holds a degree from the master's program in peace, mediation, and conflict research at the University of Tampere. Tune is also a member of the connectivity project that we've been running here at FIA. And I think her latest publication in the context of that project is now out. The article is called European Norms Trap, EU Connectivity Policies, and the Case of the Global Gateway. It's published in the journal called East Asia, and it's open access. And it also includes, the same journal also includes other publications that have appeared in the context of the project. So I would like to urge everybody to go and have a look. It's openly available to all. So Tune, I will give you the floor now.
Thank you so much, Bart. Thank you for the introductions, and thank you, Pascal, for this interesting presentation. I have, of course, been reading your publications as well on the BRI effects on conflict dynamics, and I think you very well explained your main arguments in your presentation. I think I'll use my minutes to take a few steps backwards and to connect this debate to what we already know about foreign aid and interventions in fragile contexts. Bart also asked me to reflect on the question whether the European Union has more conflict-sensitive alternatives to offer to the BRI. So I'll also comment on that question. But I'll start from actually what you were just discussing with Bart, and this is the fragile contexts. Because when reading your papers and also noticing our event heading, I was wondering, is it actually the high-risk environments that make these BRI investments interesting for us to study, or is it more something else? Because, you know, for example, the Nord Stream pipeline was terrorized in the Baltic Sea, and it can be considered as a high-risk or at least risky infrastructure because of the geopolitical context. But it is different from these BRI investments, since it takes place in this very wealthy Baltic Sea, whereas these BRI investments take place in at the other end of the continuum of distribution of global wealth. So basically in low-income, fund deficit environments. So there is a lot of asymmetry in this setting where the BRI investments are made. And I think this is what makes this extremely interesting. And I think it is relevant because this is also where the BRI's potential comes from, because other investors are not so much active in these contexts. And the BRI actually has the potential with its huge economic power to narrow down the gap between the lower income and wealthy countries, if the investments are sustainable and they benefit the local communities, create jobs and enable connectivity. And compared to the EU's Global Gateway Initiative, for example, which is supposed to mobilize something like 300 billion euros until 2027, with BRI we are talking about, I guess, $1 trillion US, estimations varying, however, but the economic potential is really huge, and thus also the potential effect on conflict and peace is much bigger than with the EU investments. And here I want to mention the concept of the peace development nexus that is quite often discussed. And it means that when we are investing in development, economic development, jobs, we also build opportunities for peace in this context where resources are scarce and there are many factors that can fuel conflicts. So it is important to understand the potential that there actually is with the BRI investments in these contexts to both economic development but also peace. Now the challenge, however, is that what we already know about external investments, foreign aid, and all kind of development interventions is that any external attempts always include huge risks. So what has been argued by peace and development scholars for a long time is that even with goodwill and noble objectives, foreign interventions in vulnerable, fragile contexts often end up producing unexpected mixed consequences. And the reasons for this, of course, are that the investors, the helpers, usually do not understand well enough the local contexts, and they end up changing them. They end up legitimizing illegitimate actors. They end up accidentally making the local beneficiaries dependent on foreign aid, undermining local agents of development, replacing the local processes for development by externally driven ones. And international donors for decades have not been able to avoid these pitfalls. And just to remind you of one example that I have been studying myself, Afghanistan is a good example of this. It was not only the liberal intervention and interventionism that failed there, but also it is an example of foreign aid and reconstruction efforts, fueling corruption, messing up power structures, supporting non-legitimate governance structures, which then become dependent on our support, and eventually then our support contributed to the outcome, which is not useful for anyone. Government collapsing, this oppressive regime of Taliban rising, and potentially a breeding ground for international terrorism also being made. And in Afghanistan, it was this kind of things such as constructing roads that had these effects on the conflict dynamics when we, for example, did not understand that these technical infrastructure projects actually can empower one warlord in comparison to another one, and this kind of our very technical support has had this kind of very political effects. And also our lack of conflict sensitivity already during the operation had the consequence that our workers there were targets, as BRI workers have been in some contexts that you already mentioned. So I think it should be in China's interest to avoid repeating these mistakes that Western actors have made with foreign aid and investments. But as you explained, there are of course concerns that this might not happen if there are not enough sensitivity and assessment in place. And of course, debt traps is something that has been discussed a lot in Western media. Researchers then debating whether they are a purposeful strategy by China to have a grip on receiving countries' governments. And I actually do not have the expertise to assess whether loans or aid are more likely to create dependence. But what I want to point out that however technical and apolitical the aid is, was it loans or aid, anyway, in these kind of asymmetrical settings, there will be changes to the power structures at the local settings and unexpected consequences to those dynamics. And we should be mindful about those consequences. Okay, then moving on to the other question, which was whether the EU has something more conflict sensitive to offer. Is the global gateway that the EU now has invented, is it more conflict sensitive or more positive for peace than the BRI? It is supposed to be the positive offer, more democratic, more secure, equal, green, transparent, and sustainable program for infrastructure investments. And it, as said, it cannot compete with BRI in quantity of investments, and therefore it has this quality focused approach, which means not only high quality of investments or infrastructure, but also European quality, so European norms and standards and values. It's a value-based program, officially committed to human rights and sustainability, while it of course also has the geopolitical aims linked to competing with the BRI. So I cannot answer the question whether it is more conflict sensitive, but there's one point that I want to make, and it starts here. I have personally criticized Global Gateway a lot, and this article that Bart just mentioned is one one of my critical pieces where I want to highlight the problems that our infrastructure investments have. I have criticized the lack of sensitivity when it comes to local ownership. I argue that the agency of locals is not empowered effectively enough, but instead we might end up undermining local agency because we have a very top-down normative approach. And so I have argued that the European Union strategy, or how it plans to do this connectivity investments, is actually in contradiction with the objectives that it declared, such as equal partnerships. And many others, of course, have made similar critiques towards this program and towards previous development aid or investments that we have made. And thanks to this critique, thanks to the research community and civil society criticizing a lot our investments, they have improved. For example, the European development cooperation has improved a lot during the past decades towards more sustainable and effective approach. And of course, not always the EU learned. We have problems with institutional memory and knowledge management in the EU, but it should be, there is a feedback loop in place, which should kind of improve our investments all the time to make them more accountable. Also, what we have declared then should be actually our strategies and implementation should match them. So as a researcher, I see this as the strength of the EU approach, that there is a lot of critique and there is accountability. There's our infrastructure investments. If they do not match the values that we have declared, there will be critique, and there is the feedback loop that will be operating, and then the policies usually do change. So my question is there a similar feedback loop in place for the BRI? Is there accountability in place for that program? I guess China will solve this problem some other way than we did, but anyway, however large the economic power is, it cannot afford to not learn from when mistakes are made and when unexpected consequences are on their way. There need to be some kind of channels, first of all from the local context, for local partners to report their concerns if there are some, but then also because the local partners might not be in the best place to criticize if they are dependent on our aid. There need to be some kind of impact assessment and accountability system for the policies in place. So these were the comments that I wanted to make, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Tune, for these comments and feedback and questions. Pascal, would you like to reply briefly?
Sure. Tune, thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to reading your article that you linked. I'm maybe just briefly going to respond to your question about accountability mechanisms for the BRI. I think the thing that is most important is Chinese image concerns, actually. So especially because we have this feeling that China is a monolithical actor. Pretty much anything a Chinese company, for example, does overseas is going to reflect back on the country of China itself to a much greater degree than, for example, Western countries, where companies are being seen as autonomous actors, separate from the government. And this is actually what has, in China itself, resulted in a lot of political pressure on companies to engage, for example, in corporate social responsibility, to conduct stakeholder outreach, to conduct impact assessments. But the problem is just that whether that actually is being done in a meaningful way is ultimately at the discretion of those companies. So as long as they are engaging in tokenistic efforts, I mean, this is something which will satisfy their supervisors back in China. And whether or not their activities overseas actually are in compliance with tight standards is then very much left to national governments in BRI member countries to assess. And there the problem is, of course, that especially in fragile and conflict-affected states, the governance capacity is often very low. So you don't have actual ministries, for example, that would be able to oversee if standards are being implemented, if impact assessments are actually realistic, or whether that is just something written, in order to get approval for a project. And yeah, that is, I think, beyond both the ability of the Chinese regulatory state as well as the host country governments to actually effectively implement. One thing, however, where I'm seeing a change is in risk management related to the BRI. So at least when it comes to decisions on how much Chinese capital is being allocated in highly risky environments, you've already seen a major reduction in the kind of capital outflows from China from the first years of the BRI until about 2018-19, so before COVID, when it already dropped off a cliff. And the reason for that is usually described as tighter scrutiny on the part of Chinese regulators, who were not as free or as willing to approve requests for overseas projects, where they are basically a veto player. So a Chinese company that wants to build a road in Pakistan has to ask for approval from the National Development and Reform Commission in China itself. And if they say no, then that road is not being built. And there's evidence, at least, that these kinds of more technical assessments are now being heeded better, at least, than in the early years, where basically politics was in control, and where if a local Chinese embassy said that we think it would be really good to build this road because it would create a positive relationship with the government, that road would get built despite the existence of other concerns. So that's at least the changes which I'm seeing on the part of accountability there.
Thanks. Okay, let's now move on to the questions. Again, I would like to ask the audience to add some more questions in the chat. There is one on the EU specifically. I can maybe add one for Pascal on CPEC first. Recently, I read, I think it was in a handbook on development cooperation, a chapter on CPEC, and it was actually surprisingly positive in terms of evaluating the CPEC. It was quite positive when it comes to providing domestic ownership of the ongoing projects in Pakistan. It was quite positively evaluated in terms of developing self-reliance for Pakistan. It had a positive development effect, and also it was positive in terms of the joint decision-making and evaluation. But what was negative was, and this has already been mentioned, was when it comes to accountability and transparency, and especially the terms and conditions of the Chinese investments are quite opaque. The conditions for these concessionary loans are very intransparent. How will future revenues be shared? Also, all the projects are implemented by Chinese companies and state-owned enterprises, obviously, and there's no fair bidding process going on, and so on. So would you agree with this overall assessment of both positive as well as negative evaluations? And then maybe adding to that, how high, because the CPEC runs all the way to Gwadar, where China already has a military basis. So how high do you estimate the risk that there will be ongoing militarization along the CPEC? And then the question for Tune comes from the audience. So when we discuss BRI projects, it's usually about less developed and fragile countries. But then while thinking about the EU's alternative offers to development cooperation, what about the EU position towards its member states that are also BRI partners, including Greece, Hungary, Italy, Poland, and so on? So maybe Pascal, you can go first.
Sure, happy to. So when it comes to the evaluation of CPEC, we've also gotten some very different answers from within Pakistan itself. And it all depends on whether you ask people who are close to the central government and its development agencies, who tend to have very optimistic or positive assessments of CPEC indeed, or if you ask people from the peripheral areas that feel that they have not gotten their fair share of it. That's like the major split there in domestic political opinion. When it comes to the advantages, I mean, some of them are undeniable. So, for example, this electricity shortfall that you used to have in Pakistan, that used to be much, much worse. And the fact that a lot of plants went online rapidly under CPEC, so within 3 years, you actually had plugged this overall national electricity shortfall. That was indeed seen as a big success. But then you again have to look at the downside, because those plants are coal plants. And not only is that a huge environmental problem, but it is actually also a problem with the economics of the whole thing. And that's something that you could see last year when you had this dual phenomenon that the Pakistani rupee declined severely in value. That was basically a homemade problem. And at the same time, the war in Ukraine drove up international resource prices. And the thing is that Pakistan has only a very, very limited supply of domestic coal. So what they basically have to do is to buy the coal from Indonesia and then ship it all the way to Pakistan and distribute it by road in the country, which is very, very expensive. And at least last year resulted in a situation where the capacity could not actually be economically utilized. So it meant the plants were running under capacity and you had a return of this energy crisis. And the argument there was that if you had bet on renewables, for example, you would not have faced this specific problem. So that's kind of one of the things that was very, very prominent on display there. You're, of course, also correct when it comes to the complaints against it in transparency. That is a big issue, not just in Pakistan, of course. And the fact that there is often also not a domestic job creation effect, because the construction itself is usually done by Chinese companies that come in. They only hire local labor at a very, very low level. So basically tough physical labor, but anything that requires an education is going to be filled by the Chinese. And where the question to me is not so much about the construction, but whether we will also see the same pattern about industrialization, whether that's also going to be like a Chinese managerial class overseeing Pakistani menial laborers, or if we can actually see a pronounced education effect and where those skill centers can deliver what they promise so far. So there, at least, I would also lean maybe a bit towards optimism. And then very briefly about militarization. So this is actually a misunderstanding, I think, that often comes up. Gwadar is not home to a Chinese military base. So the only overseas Chinese military presence is in Djibouti. And that is actually in the same place as a lot of European, American, and even Japanese presences as well. Gwadar so far has been militarily used only by the Pakistani military. There is, of course, the question if China at some point might also use it as maybe as a stepping stone to the Indian Ocean. And that is, of course, a possibility. But of course, this would require a separate agreement with Pakistan, not just on constructing infrastructure, but of actually stationing Chinese forces overseas. So this is still, at that point, a sovereign choice of the Pakistani government if they want that to happen or not. So that is just something that often comes up, that Chinese harbors are basically already footholds of the Chinese Navy overseas. And that is, at least as we can tell today, not the case. But yeah, thanks for those questions. And yeah, Tuna, I'll probably leave you first before we return to the audience. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Pascal, and also for the correction on the Gwadar base issue. Tuna, please.
Thank you. Thanks for the good question. It was really assessed to be a challenge for the EU member states to be able to agree on such broad political agenda as the Global Gateway is, exactly because of the fact that some member states already host BRI projects themselves, and because of some other challenges as well. But they managed to agree on this program and also to connect it very closely with the EEAS, so External Action Service and Commission. So it was quite an achievement to like kind of bridge the silos inside the EU. But of course, it needs to be acknowledged that quite many of what is now part of the Global Gateway the investments were already ongoing. So the program also builds on many things that the member states were already doing, for example, in Africa or in the Western Balkans or even overseas in infrastructure investments that are now only packaged as being part of the global gateway and connected to those values and geopolitical goals that now were agreed. And of course, it is a challenge also from now on to keep these member states' direct investments, even private investments, connected to the EU approach. Maybe one positive thing is that with the war, the member states have maybe come a bit more closer to each other in terms of threat perceptions, and they are more unanimous about the need to have such a common approach and to share the values and to connect those investments to the joint goals. So there are some gaps have been minimized already.
Thank you, Tine. I don't see any further questions from the audience. If there would be, we still have about 5 minutes. If there still would be one, by all means, write it in the chat box. If not, I can maybe ask one concluding question to Pascal. It's maybe a very broad question about the idea that infrastructure can help build lasting peace. So I was reminded of that question because, well, in a former life, together with a colleague, Michael Matlin, we wrote a paper comparing the development cooperation practices of China and Japan. And we kind of claimed that what Japan historically has been criticized for, China is now being criticized for. Basically, the idea that economic infrastructure can help build peace. And maybe that's a bit different in Western countries where we place much higher focus on the political aspect and also on social infrastructure, fight against poverty and so on. So how do you see this? Is the truth somewhere in the middle, or what's your take on this?
So first of all, I would say that building peace is not a primary motivation behind the BRI. This is maybe something that came in as a secondary motivation as a result of its presence in very conflict-affected societies. But it's not like the BRI is primarily like, for example, a development aid project. It is mostly financed through commercial loans, and that also means that there's of course at least a profit interest involved somewhere there. You are correct that China is not alone with this kind of approach of pursuing development as kind of a sufficient solution to peace, or at least rhetorically arguing that it can be, and that this is more split maybe between industrialized Western and non-Western powers nowadays, because as you correctly pointed out, Japan is actually both in its practices and in the areas, interestingly, that it targets quite close to China, a very comparable case. So that, yeah, I think this is something where there's a genuine split in opinions, and that has to do with the kinds of political histories of the respective countries also, where in China actually focusing on development as an apolitical issue was a very, very popular thing to do in the 1980s, when many people still remembered the Mao era and really wanted to turn the page on politics. And that's why this was really a program that was capable of building a national consensus around. Whereas, however, in many of the countries that the BRI is now targeting, you don't have the same consensus, and it's also going to be very, very hard to build one because their political history is another one and still driven by political differences that are just then kind of extended to a new battlefield when it comes to the distribution of BRI projects, for example. That's just what I would say on that one. I've spotted a question in the chat about.
Yes, there is one question, probably not maybe the easiest question, but it's about the Russia's war in Ukraine and how does that affect or change the situation concerning the BRI? If you have any thoughts on that. And maybe, Tine, if you would like to add something first on either of these two questions. This one and the previous one, and then we can give the final word to Pascal.
Yeah, maybe I can just quickly say that, of course, what has been realized because of the war in Europe is the dependencies that come with connectivity, and it has kind of like highlighted the fact that we now need to pay more attention on who owns our connectivity and our connections, and so maybe there will be a bit more, even more active approach towards connectivity and a bit more strategic approach after this war. But I'll leave you to continue. Thank you.
Okay, then yeah, just briefly, I think the actual effect on the BRI in Ukraine has been pretty minimal, because Ukraine was not a big target country for the BRI. I think that was just about exploratory studies for enlarging 2 harbors that had not actually reached a point of implementation. So there, at least, you did not see disruption. It is also, interestingly, not so much disrupted the BRI in adjacent countries. So you could imagine that, because you have this vision of a trans-Eurasian transport corridor, that this would be completely derailed by the breakdown in relations between Russia and Europe, and of course the installment of a sanctions regime that is making economic exchanges pretty much impossible nowadays. But to that, I would just say that the importance of the Eurasian corridor is actually being a bit overstated when it comes to the BRI, because the priorities, at least as far as I have seen, and when you look at where the money is going, are in other world regions, like especially South Asia, Southeast Asia, West Asia, and West Africa. And Central Asia is one, but the priority there is actually on building pipeline networks, so energy connectivity, not so much as transport connectivity. But of course, I mean, the war has touched so many fields that it will probably take a lot more time to delve into all of those, and I'm just going to leave it there with the immediate effects.
Thank you. Excellent answer. I think the time has come to slowly wrap up this seminar. We're already 5 minutes into overtime, so I would like to thank Pascal for his excellent presentation and further comments. I would like to thank Tuna also for her expert feedback. I would like to thank the audience for being here today, and I'd like to conclude by saying that our next installment of this webinar series will be in May, and then we'll be discussing Japanese infrastructure development in Myanmar. So I hope to see you all again then, and for now, thank you so much, and the seminar is now closed. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.